Hello. I made a video somewhat similar to this about a year ago, but I think it's perhaps I want to make this one a little bit more condensed and a little bit more specific. And I want to specifically address the narrative that we so often hear regarding European colonialism of America, specifically North America. I'm not going to talk so much about Latin America here, but specifically North America. And I think that too often the narrative is black and white, and I think the reality is a lot more complex. Um, so there's one reason I'm choosing to make this now is because of that whole exchange, which I covered, the Covington Catholic boys and the Native American man Nathan Phillips, where he came across as kind of the heroic figure, and I think there's more to it than that. But it got me thinking just about the general narrative that we hear these days. We hear a lot about racism in the American media, in the British media, and it's almost always from the angle of white privilege and these terrible white people keeping down minorities. That's the angle that it is so often targeted at, or rather scoped through. That's the narrative, right? Um, Now, for obvious reasons, I don't have time in a video to make a complete synopsis of everything I want to say. And I haven't sufficiently researched every aspect of this. I'm really a layman in terms of what I know, but there are some things I want to discuss and things that I think people really need to consider. So let me make a disclaimer from the outset because I don't want to be misunderstood. Without question, there were terrible atrocities committed by white settlers in the Americas. Without question, there were examples, well, more than examples, there was systematic destruction of Native American culture. And without question, there was unforgivable things happened. One example being the Trail of Tears, um, and there's many others. So I don't want anyone to think I'm an apologist for wrongs committed by white European settlers in the Americas. But I do think that it is important to consider that it isn't a simple case of the evil white man versus the noble, peaceful Native American. That's a lot of nonsense. What I want to point out here is that not all Native Americans were noble, peaceful people. They just weren't. And I'd like to see a little bit more honesty in this. I think what's happened since probably around the late 60s onwards, there's kind of been a revisionism. What I mean by that is, okay, you could argue that very old cowboy films were too simplistic. They were the goodies versus the baddies, right? The cowboys versus the Indians. And they were too simplistic. But I don't think a Western could be made nowadays without an angle of making at least some of the white protagonists look like brutes. And it would be very difficult to portray Native Americans in any sort of violent light. Now, I watched The Magnificent Seven the other day, the remake of it. I thought that was very good, actually. I thought it was a good, entertaining film. But there's one scene where the Native American character, one of the Magnificent Seven, kills another Native American and he says, "You're a disgrace." Now, had that been one of the white characters doing that, it just would never have worked. Um, I saw Hostiles, I believe it was the beginning of last year, with Christian Bale, Rosamund Pike. And again, it had an angle about which was aiming at white guilt. I thought it was a good film overall, but it was definitely pitching to that. Um, when I hear people say that the white Europeans came in and killed all the Native Americans, I cringe because it's such an oversimplification of history. It's ridiculous. If the white Europeans came in and just killed Native Americans on sight, they could never have traded. They could never have expanded into the territory. The Native Americans knew the territory. They relied on them. Just a quick word about the Native Americans themselves. Firstly, they're not one homogenous group. I understand there's something like 545 federally recognized indigenous nations and tribes. 545 in the United States alone, many more in Canada. And that's not including all the groups in Latin America. So that's a very important point because when you work from the narrative of the evil white man versus the Native American, there isn't one Native American group. But the origins of Native Americans, plural, research on this, I'm mistaken, seems to indicate that they may have came to the North American continent after the last ice age, about 14,000 years ago. So certainly they had a very, very long history on the land. But when we talk about ownership, well, does anyone really own land in a sense of, if we're going to talk about ownership, well, you could make a case that every group in history has dominated other groups at some point. So why is there unique criticism of white Europeans? I think the reason for that is because they were uniquely powerful. They had the military technology to beat their opponents. It's That's what happened, and I think because they had that power, then they got the upper hand. The fact of the matter is, 19th century America, and like I say, it's not possible to go into to make a really in-depth synopsis in this video, but 19th century America was a free for all. Manifest Destiny was still shaping the land. The War of Independence may have established the United States of America, but it was still an expanding country, and it was a lot smaller than it is today. So when we think about, for example, the Great Western Gold Rush, that was a free for all, and it was pretty brutal. It's what gave the image to the Wild West. Actually, you probably find that modern American cities are a lot more violent than the Wild West. So there's a little bit of hyperbole about that. Nevertheless, it was a pretty violent place. And there was, without doubt, there was discrimination against Irish railway builders, but even more against the Chinese. I mean, some of the worst massacres at that time actually took place against Chinese miners. Some of the worst massacres in American history. But the point I'm making is that in the 19th century, it was a hard scrabble life for everyone in the West. Everyone. I mean, the idea of white privilege just doesn't fit into the reality of a lot of those white settlers who were moving westwards. So that was, they died from disease. These were tough, tough conditions, and they were It was a hard scrabble life for everyone there. So the notion that it was these privileged white people going in and stealing the Native American land, I think, is overly simplistic. Of course, there was subjugation going on, but it was the case that the Europeans were militarily more sophisticated, therefore they got the upper hand in the long run. But the notion that it was these peaceful Native Americans minding their own business brings me to the point about intertribal warfare, and it's something that is very often overlooked, but it is very important because we talk about, or we think, the left wing revisionist viewpoint is the evil white people came in and killed all the Native Americans. Well, what about a Native American subjugation of other Native American groups? Why do we never hear about that? At least not anywhere near enough as it should be um, acknowledged. For example, the Sioux and Pawnee. There was one example, one massacre known as Massacre Canyon in Nebraska. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia article here. It was described as one of the last hostilities between the Pawnee and the Sioux, August the 5th, 1873. A large band of Oglala and Sioux, numbering around 1,500, led by Two Strike, Little Wounded Spotted Tail, attacked the party of Pawnee. They killed male warriors, but they also killed women and children. And this is by no means unique. There was one tribe in, I believe it was upstate New York. I don't quote me on this. I think it was the Huron tribe. I'm not 100% sure about that. But there was one tribe that was totally eradicated. Totally eradicated. Um, So intertribal warfare was rampant. The idea that pre Columbian America was a peaceful place where the Native Americans were at one with nature and they just lived in harmony was total nonsense. The same for South America. I remember when Apocalypto came out, it got criticized for depicting the Native Americans in a violent light. But the insinuation there is that they were all peaceful. Well, no, they weren't actually. And it's this idea that it's I think it's almost more insulting to suggest that Native Americans are. I think it's patronizing to suggest that they all had this peaceful culture where they lived in harmony with nature. There was subjugation between the various Native American tribes. There was ongoing warfare. There was slavery, and they didn't have a moral code in many cases. Women and children were not spared. And yes, they also attacked settlers, and settlers attacked them. There was ongoing hostilities, but I tire a little bit of the narrative that it was just the evil white man came in and killed all the Indians. It's not that simple. There's a lot of aspects to look at. For example, European diseases brought in, but the very early settlers, the very first Europeans, they were ignorant about medicine. So the argument about genocide is problematic because genocide insinuates a specific political act to eradicate a people and a culture. Now, if we're looking at disease, that's not an act of genocide. I would certainly concede that Native American culture was deliberately destroyed in many cases. I mean, in Canada, Native First Nation Canadians and the Canadian government's acknowledges were forbidden from speaking their native languages. So there was definitely dark chapters, even in Canada, which is a country generally seen as very progressive. But I just think that, to be honest about this, today I think Native American leaders need to be a little bit more honest about their own past, rather than framing everything through the Europeans colonized us and took everything. There is truth in that, of course there is, but I think it's just an oversimplification of history that doesn't help anyone by presenting it as good versus evil. It's not that simple. It's really not. Um, Another example of the morally dubious aspects of all this, the Cherokee kept African American slaves. Now, have Cherokee elders today ever acknowledged or apologized for their role in the slave trade? Maybe they have, I don't know. But I really think that when we talk about European colonization of the Americas, of course there was atrocities. I would argue that the atrocities committed by the Spanish conquistadors especially were particularly vicious and brutal. Um, but we're talking about an event that took place over centuries. We're talking about a very complex process, and I honestly believe there are Native American tribes with a warlike culture. Had they had the upper hand militarily, they would have they'd be running America today, and it's very possible that the white settlers would have been subjugated, and the situation would be reversed. The reason America is the way it is, it became a nation state, is because the white Europeans had military prowess. Now, again, in no way am I downplaying some of the atrocities that they committed. I mean, the Trail of Tears was a crime against humanity, and there were other examples. But can we just stop this oversimplification of this aspect of history? i.e., the white people came in and killed all the Native Americans. It's just not that simple. There was intertribal warfare. There was subjugation between the various Native American groups. They weren't one homogenous group. They had distinctive cultures, distinctive languages, incredible diversity. And 19th century America was hard scrabble. I'm talking about the West, was hard scrabble for everyone. I mean, anyone that thinks the life of a settler going on the Oklahoma Trail or going out west was one of luxury or white privilege is deluded. So I just think that there needs to be a little bit more honesty about this. I'm not saying that forget the atrocities that were committed by white settlers, but let's also not oversimplify things and make out that Native Americans were always morally upright. They weren't. I mean, when the Sioux killed Pawnee women, was that morally upright? No. When the Cherokee kept African American slaves, these are just things I think need to be a little bit more acknowledged.